Hey everybody, I'm here to talk to you about chapters 23 and 24 in To Kill a Mockingbird, using the study guide one more time to guide my thoughts. So if you just want to open the study guide and follow along, we can discuss the questions. The first question for chapter 23 asks, what does Atticus tell Jim about what the trial did to Bob Ewell's credibility? For this, I go to page 249 in my book, this version of the book, and Atticus says in the middle of the page, or actually Jim starts by saying, "Nothing's happened. We're scared for you, and we think you ought to do something about it." Atticus smiled wryly. "Do what? Put him under a peace bond? When a man says he's going to get you, looks like he means it," says Jim. "He meant it when he said it," says Atticus. And this is the important part right here. "Jim, see if you can stand in Bob Ewell's shoes a minute. I destroyed his last shred of credibility at that trial. If he had any to begin with, the man had to have some kind of a comeback. His kind always does. So spitting in my face and threatening me save Mayella Ewell one extra beating, that's something I'll gladly take. He had to take it out on somebody, and I'd rather it be me than a house full of children out there. Do you understand?" This is interesting in that Atticus is asking Jim to stand in Bob Ewell's shoes in the same way that he's asked Jim and Scout to stand in Boo Radley's shoes, and asked them also to understand Tom Robinson's dilemma. And so here Atticus is showing compassion for one of the most dislikable people in the entire novel, and saying you have to understand Bob Ewell and the fact that I destroyed his credibility. Again, this shows the compassion that Atticus has and the compassion that he's trying to teach his children. The next question, what does Atticus tell Jim about white men cheating African Americans? And here again we hear Atticus's compassion for his fellow man. Atticus says, or actually Jim again starts talking. "Doesn't make it right," said Jim stolidly. He beat his fist softly on his knee. "You can't convict a man on evidence like that. You can't. You couldn't, but they could and did. The older you grow, the more of it you'll see. The one place where a man ought to get a square deal is in a courtroom. But any color of the rainbow. But people have a way of carrying their resentments right into a jury box. As you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of your life. But let me tell you something, and don't you forget it. Whenever a white man does that to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine a family he's come from, that white man is trash." So Atticus here is talking about how the white community treats the African American community, and here he's directly calling those people that treat the African American community in this way are trash. This is the most ardent criticism of the white community that we hear from Atticus. This idea of the white community versus the black community pervades this chapter, and Atticus continually comes down on the side of the African Americans in the chapter. Again, calling the white man who would treat an African American man, calls that white man trash. Question 3, who on the jury was reluctant to convict Tom Robinson? Why is this a step in the right direction in terms of racism in the town? This question can be answered on page 253 when Atticus talks about how one of the Cunninghams that had been at the courthouse the night before had been the last holdout in terms of convicting. Here I quote from page 253. Our father chuckled. "You've many more miles to go, son. A jury's vote's supposed to be secret. Serving on a jury forces a man to make up his mind and declare himself about something. Men don't like to do that. Sometimes it's unpleasant." "Tom's jury sure made its mind in a hurry," Jim muttered. Atticus's fingers went to his watch pocket. "No, it didn't," he said, more to himself than to us. "That was one thing that made me think, well, this may be the shadow of a beginning. That jury took a few hours, and an inevitable verdict, maybe, but usually it takes them just a few minutes. This time," he broke off and looked at us, "you might like to know that there was one fellow who took considerable wearing down. In the beginning he was raring for an outright acquittal." "Who?" Jim was astonished. Atticus' eyes twinkled. "It's not for me to say, but I'll tell you this much. He was one of your old Sarum friends." Here he's saying that it was the Cunningham man, Walter Cunningham, from the night before, who had been the last holdout in terms of conviction. Atticus is saying this is a small step in the right direction and that we'd convince this one man. On the following page, Jim says, I don't understand. He wanted to kill you last night, and yet he supported you today. And Atticus explains that they'd won his respect, and with that respect, they'd won his understanding. So again, this idea that Atticus is slowly trying to chip away at this pervading racism in the town. In the final paragraph of the chapter, we've got multiple pages where Scout, after hearing that Mr. Cunningham had not wanted to convict and had taken some wearing down, Scout says that when she gets back to school, she's going to invite Walter Cunningham, the little boy, back over for dinner. And Aunt Alexandra says, no, you can't do that. And there's a prolonged discussion about class and goodness in people. Aunt Alexandra calls the Cunninghams trash. Jim tries to explain that there's two different kinds of people in the world, those that can read and those that can't. There's just a long conversation about what it means to be a good person or a bad person. And Jim becomes increasingly frustrated with this whole class society, racism, and unfairness in the town. And he finally concludes in the last paragraph, that's what I thought too, he said at last, when I was your age. If there's one kind of folks, why can't they get along with each other? If they're all alike, why do they go out of their way to despise each other? Scout, I think I'm beginning to understand something. I think I'm beginning to understand why Boo Radley stayed shut up in his house all this time. It's because he wants to stay inside. So here Jim is saying, society is unfair. I'm beginning to understand it, and the more that I understand it, the more that I dislike the way that people treat each other. Here he's grouping everybody together. He's saying that Aunt Alexandra shouldn't be so mean to the Cunninghams shouldn't be racist against the Robinsons, the Ewells are despicable people, but we should start to understand that those children are living in an awful, awful situation. The entire weight of the inequality in the town is coming to bear on Jim's shoulders, and he's saying, I understand why Boo Radley doesn't want to come out. Society is unfair, and that's why he's saying I want to stay inside. So there's an understanding on Jim's part and a maturity that we're seeing from both children throughout the course of this discussion. That maturity is again shown in chapter 24. The first question is compare Scout from the beginning of the book to the Scout that you see at the start of this chapter. And here I go to page 261 and just read this paragraph at the top of the page. The ladies of the Missionary Society are meeting at the house, and Calpurnia has made a lot of food for the ladies, and they're all sitting around in the dining room sort of gossiping and talking about what's happening in the town. Scout, unsure what to do with herself, is sitting in the kitchen with Calpurnia, and this is where we get the description. I didn't know whether to go into the dining room or stay out. Aunt Alexandra told me to join them for refreshments. It was not necessary that I attend the business part of the meeting. She said it'd bore me. I was wearing my pink Sunday dress, shoes, and a petticoat, and reflected that if I spilled anything, Calpurnia would have to wash my dress again for tomorrow. This had been a busy day for her. I decided to stay out. So in this one paragraph, we see that Scout is wearing a pink dress. She's also got a petticoat on, which is sort of an undergarment that she'd be wearing. She's thinking about Calpurnia and saying, I didn't want to spill anything on the dress because then Calpurnia would have to wash the dress again. And she's deciding whether she wants to go in and join the ladies or not. She decides in the following paragraphs that she'll help Calpurnia serve food. This is a completely different Scout than the Scout that we saw at the beginning of the book. She doesn't mind wearing the dress that she's got. She's worried about spilling something on it because that would make more work for Calpurnia. She doesn't want to embarrass Aunt Alexandria, and she decides to help Calpurnia with the serving of the food. All of these things show a Scout who has matured into a young woman rather than the young tomboy that we saw at the beginning of it. There's two different things that happen in the conversations as this chapter goes forward, and both show the again the racism and the inequality in the town. One is that there's a woman called Ms. Merriweather, or Mrs. Merriweather, that is talking about this man J. Grimes Everett, and she's talking about Mr. Everett's work in Africa. Here I quote from page 263. Mrs. Merriweather played her voice like an organ. Every word she said received its full measure. Quote, the poverty, the darkness, The immorality. Nobody but J. Grimes Everett knows. You know, when the church gave me that trip to the campground, J. Grimes Everett said to me, "Was he there, ma'am?" I thought. "Home on leave." J. Grimes Everett said to me, he said, "Mrs. Merriweather, you have no conception of what we are fighting over there." That's what he said to me. "Yes, ma'am." I said to him, "Mr. Everett," I said, "the ladies of Macomb, Alabama Methodist Episcopal Church South are behind you 100%. That's what I said to him. And you know, right then and there, I made a pledge in my heart. I said to myself, when I go home, I'm going to give a course on the Maroons and bring J. Grimes Everett's message to Macomb. And that's just what I'm going to do. So J. Grimes Everett's message is that we need to be compassionate towards these underprivileged communities in Africa that don't have any education or food, and they live in shacks, and that we need to take care of these people. And Ms. Merriweather is saying you have no conception of what these people are going through. This is like hypocritical, and that of course they have some conception of what these people are going through. They have the exact same thing on the outskirts of their town, with an African American community being marginalized to the point where they're living in shacks with no money and no chance of an education, and the racism in the town is holding them in place. And then you also have the Yules that are living in squalid poverty outside of town. And so the fact that Macomb and these ladies from the Missionary Society need to follow this man J. Everett Grimes and his message about Africa and be completely blind to the fact that the same exact things are happening in their town shows the hypocrisy of these ladies. The ladies then go further and as noted in one of the questions, in one of the most racist passages in the entire novel, they talk about the African American community's response to the conviction of Tom Robinson for a rape that he did not commit, and the fact that he's now doing time in prison as they appeal this. And so here you have Mrs. Merriweather saying, again, she turned to me. Mrs. Merriweather was one of those childish adults who find it necessary to assume a different tone of voice when speaking to children. "Nothing, Jean Louise," she said in a stately largo. "The cooks and field hands are just dissatisfied, but they're settling down now. They grumbled all next day after that trial." Mrs. Merriweather faced Mrs. Farrow. "Gertrude, I tell you, there's nothing more distracting than a sulky darky. Their mouths go down to here. Just ruins your day to have one of them in the kitchen. You know what I said to my Sophie, Gertrude? I said, Sophie, you simply are not being a Christian today. Jesus Christ never went around grumbling and complaining. And you know, it did her good. She took her eyes off that floor and said, 'No, ma'am, Ms. Merriweather, Jesus never went around grumbling.' I tell you, Gertrude, you never ought to let an opportunity go by to witness for the Lord." So here you have Mrs. Merriweather talking about the African American community who are rightly outraged by the conviction of Tom Robinson, and she's complaining that the next day they were just being sad and really bringing everybody down with the way they were acting, which is just atrocious to think about. I'm surprised that the African Americans didn't rise up and try to take down their white employers after this verdict. It was a completely unjust verdict, and the fact that Mrs. Merriweather is simply complaining that they look so sad is just atrocious. And then to bring the idea that Jesus Christ would not have allowed this to happen, that he would have told these people to have a smiley face and that he never grumbled, is absolutely false. Jesus Christ talked a lot about the falsehoods and the hypocrisy in society and how we needed to treat each other with love and kindness and understanding. And so here Ms. Merriweather is talking about a completely perverted understanding of the Bible, a completely perverted understanding of what the African American community is going through, and just a really, really racist rant against this entire community. About halfway through the chapter, Atticus comes to the house, and this is one of the most startling passages in the novel, in that it creeps up on you. And so they've been talking about the fact that there's an appeal that can take place. Atticus has been talking about the fact that the the Cunninghams had wanted to kill him the night before, but then one of them had been the holdout on the jury. You have the understanding of Jim coming to an understanding about the way the community works and trying to figure it all out. And there's a sense of hope throughout all of this that things might work out. And then all of a sudden, Atticus comes in and he says, "Cal, I want you to go with me out to Helen Robinson's house." "What's the matter?" Aunt Alexandra asked, alarmed by the look on my father's face. "Tom's dead." Aunt Alexandra put her hand to her mouth. "They shot him," said Atticus. "He was running. It was during their exercise period. They said he just broke into a blind, raving charge at the fence and started climbing over, right in front of them. The guards shoot a couple of times over his head and then shoot to kill and kill Tom Robinson." And so it's a startling revelation in that it comes so quickly with no build-up, simply Atticus saying that Tom is dead. And so from this point forward, we're trying to figure out the resolution to this, and you're also going to get Bob Ewell's sinister revenge trying to be played out on the town. And so Atticus has come home to take Calpurnia out to tell Helen Robinson that her husband is dead. After this revelation and what it does to Atticus, Aunt Alexandra starts to become a more likable character. She says near the end of the chapter, "I can't say I approve of everything he does, Maudie, but he's my brother, and I just want to know when this will ever end." Her voice rose. "It tears him to pieces. He doesn't show it much, but it tears him to pieces. I've seen him win. What else do they want from him, Maudie? What else?" "What does who want, Alexandra?" Ms. Maudie asked. "I mean this town. They're perfectly willing to let him do what they're afraid to do themselves. It might lose him a nickel. They're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health doing what they're afraid to do." So here, Aunt Alexandra is starting to show that she understands that this town is unjust, and she understands the burden that they're putting on Atticus, and she understands how the inequality and the injustice of what is happening in this town is eating away at Atticus. This understanding allows Aunt Alexandra and Ms. Maudie to forge a friendship where they agree together that they'll go back into the dining room and deal with the women of the missionary society. And again, there's an understanding between the two about the town, about Atticus, and about what's happening. Aunt Alexandra becomes much more likable at this point in the novel than she's been in the past. So I hope this has helped in your understanding of chapters 23 and 24. I'll be back soon with the interpretation and analysis of chapters 25 and 26. Thank you.